Sage of the Shadows, where dark whispers echo through the night.
Audio story, Blood Twins. Chapter 9, Mist over the Old Mill. The forest seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing thicker with every step. The crackle of distant movement, the soft scrape of weapons against tactical gear, and the occasional heavy breath were the only sounds that marked the vampire's progress. The trees whispered secrets, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky, as if the forest itself were alive, watching, waiting. The vampires moved as one, their forms melding into the shadows, every movement precise and calculated. Though no words were spoken, the tension was palpable. Irina's blue eyes met Togi's green gaze as they ran side by side, their shared understanding needing no words. Whatever unspoken history lay between them, a wary trust forged in conflict, it was enough for this moment. For now, they were a single, united force, bound by necessity. Behind them, the others followed in a loose formation, each keeping to their own roles. The mill loomed ahead, its crumbling stone walls partially collapsed at the corners, an eerie silhouette in the darkened mist. It was ancient, the walls weathered by time, covered in ivy and moss that clung desperately to what remained of its structure. The ground was uneven, littered with debris, fallen stones, and scattered remnants of an old barricade that had long since given way to nature. The air felt thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and somewhere in the distance, a faint sound of rushing water murmured from the creek that ran alongside the property, a reminder of the mill's once vital role in harnessing the flow of nature. The place felt abandoned, forgotten, save for the few hunters who lingered in the shadows, guarding what was left. The forest surrounding the mill was no less daunting, its trees reaching upward like skeletal hands, their gnarled limbs intertwined. Here, nature had taken back what humans once controlled, and the land was riddled with old traps, pressure plates in the soil, tripwires hidden in the tall grass, and walls made of jagged rocks designed to impede anyone not familiar with the land. The hunters knew this territory well, and their traps were expertly placed, but so did the vampires. Every step they took was measured, anticipating the unseen dangers that lay ahead. As they neared the mill, the first guard appeared, a young man, barely more than a boy. His gear was a mismatched blend of tactical armor, the kind that screamed military training but not yet battle-hardened. The bulletproof vest fit snugly, but his stance was stiff, betraying inexperience. His hand lingered on the wooden stake at his belt, the weight of his weapon a silent reminder of the fear gnawing at him. The scarred skin beneath his armor was taut, as if he were bracing for a danger that felt just out of reach, but ever present. Togi didn't wait. His eyes flicked to his squad, and the signal was given without a word. The mill's silent air thickened with anticipation. The guard never stood a chance. With the grace of a shadow, Togi was on him, his blade slicing through the air like a whisper. It found its mark in the boy's throat, a clean strike, quick as a striking viper. The sound of flesh tearing, the spurt of blood as the guard crumpled, was drowned out by the rapid, rhythmic pounding of Togi's pulse. No time for hesitation, no time for relief. He was already moving. The next hunter, a lanky man in his mid-30s, hunched low behind a large fallen stone, caught a glimpse of the chaos. His eyes widened just as the body of his comrade hit the ground with a thud, the momentary shock freezing him in place. The flicker of instinct, the gut knowledge that something had gone horribly wrong, almost sent him scrambling for his radio. Almost. His hand twitched toward it, the radio's static buzz already climbing in his mind. But Kane was already upon him. Kane moved like a strike of lightning, the air thick with his presence before the hunter even knew what was coming. His dagger found the man's throat. The hunter's eyes widened in disbelief, but his body never had a chance to react. Kane's motion was seamless, deadly, before the man's body hit the ground in a soft whisper, a life snuffed out in a single breath. No struggle, just silence. Corvin was already scanning the area, his sharp eyes locking onto the third hunter, a tall, wiry figure stumbling through the dark, already reaching for his radio. He was frantic, disoriented, his pulse racing as the cold realization hit him. They were outmatched. Corvin didn't hesitate. His dagger sliced through the air, a flash of silver that tore through the hunter's ribs with horrific accuracy. The man's breath was stolen before he could even make a sound. His body folded, crumpling under its own weight, like a marionette with its strings cut. Another one down. Corvin's gaze didn't linger, there was no room for sentiment. The final guard, a hulking brute, built like a brawler, his stance wide and defensive, had seen enough. His hand moved for the wooden stake, fingers trembling around its shaft. His body was a tower of muscle and instinct, but the sudden realization of just how much they were outnumbered was gnawing at his resolve. He scanned the shadows, heart racing, hoping for some sign of his comrades. But Elias was already on him. His blade came from the side, swift and ruthless, cutting through the hunter's defenses. The hulking figure tried to react, but it was too late. Elias's strike was lethal, swift. The man's last breath escaped in a ragged gasp before he crumpled, as if all the strength had drained from his body in an instant. Togi's eyes swept over the scene. His squad was moving like a well-oiled machine, but his focus shifted as the sound of rustling grew louder from the edge of the mill. More were coming, 10 more hunters, advancing in a loose formation, yet unaware of the slaughter. Togi's gaze locked with Irina's. A moment passed, silent, tense. There was no time to waste. But there was something in the air now, a shift. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. His sharp eyes studied her, a flicker of something passing between them. The unspoken question lingered. Could I trust her? The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, tension rising, but then Togi's voice broke through the stillness. Irina, inside. Now. His words were a command, not a suggestion. No room for hesitation. Irina's chest tightened, but she didn't hesitate. Irina, with a nod, moved toward the mill's entrance, her presence ghostly as she slipped through the shadows. Irina followed, her senses heightened, her every step weighed with urgency. Her eyes flicked toward Togi once more, but there was no time to dwell. His gaze still lingered in her mind, sharp, calculating. Inside the mill, the air was thick with decay, the stench of mildew and rot clinging to the walls. Every creak of the wooden beams above echoed like a warning. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, debris scattered like forgotten remnants of a past life. The wind howled through the shattered windows, adding an eerie edge to the silence. And then, movement. Irina struck first. The first hunter, a tall, wiry man, barely had time to register the danger before Irina's blade tore through his throat. Blood sprayed in a violent arc, coating the cold stone floor. The hunter's body went limp, but Irina didn't wait to see it fall. She was already moving again, her focus fixed on the next target. Irina was a step behind. The second hunter, a stocky man, eyes wide with confusion, tried to react. He reached for his stake, but it was already too late. Irina's blade sank deep into his side, and before he could even gasp in pain, one of the daggers twisted into his throat, sealing his fate. The hunter crumpled, blood pooling around him, but Irina didn't slow. She was already scanning for her next move. The third hunter, a woman, her hands shaking as she raised her pistols, was too slow. She was caught off guard, stunned by the speed of the assault. But her hesitation was her undoing. Irina's foot landed with brutal force against the woman's chest. The hunter was thrown backward, crashing through the rotting window frame, the glass exploding into the night air. Her scream was cut short as she hit the ground with a sickening thud. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of blood dripping onto the cold, cracked stone floor. The carnage was swift, merciless, but it wasn't over. Irina's eyes flicked to Irina, who was already wiping blood from her blades, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. But Irina didn't share the sentiment. The documents, the real prize, were already within reach. She caught sight of Irina's gaze drifting away, momentarily lost in the satisfaction of the kill. It was just enough time. Without a second thought, Irina's hand shot out, her fingers brushing over the scattered documents and maps that lay in disarray on the nearby table. She snatched them up with practiced ease, stuffing them beneath her cloak in one smooth, decisive motion. The papers felt heavy in her hands, their importance clear. As she did so, she didn't spare a glance at Irena, fully aware that her companion was too absorbed in her own indulgence to notice. The documents were everything, more important than any fleeting smugness or pride. Irena didn't pause to savor the moment, moving quickly, her pulse racing with the urgency of the mission. She couldn't afford to waste time. Without a second glance at Irena, she moved down the stairs, her every step heavy with urgency. The scent of blood clung to her like a second skin, sharpening her senses. Time was running out. Behind her, Irena's footsteps followed, the familiar sound of her approach almost too quiet, too steady. As they reached the edge of the decaying mill, Irena's eyes flicked toward the stone walls, where Togi and the rest of the squad already waited. But for what? Her heart skipped a beat, a cold shiver sliding down her spine. Something about the way Togi had looked at her earlier, it had been calculating, assessing, as though he was measuring her every move, weighing whether he could trust her. The thought of it gnawed at her, churning like a storm at the back of her mind. Togi's voice crackled in her ear, his tone sharp but controlled. All clear. Return to camp. Irena gave a brief nod, but her heart remained heavy, weighed down by a feeling she couldn't shake. The mission was over, but the war, was far from won. The darkness of the night pressed closer, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. Each step away from the mill felt like another weight was added to her chest. The group moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath them. The forest around them was eerily still. Irena's mind wandered back to the moments in the mill. The smell of blood still clung to her senses, but it was the unspoken tension between them that made her skin prickle. She felt eyes on her, an unspoken scrutiny that made her move a little faster, a little more tense. Irena, just ahead of her, was unusually quiet. Irena's eyes narrowed. There was something off about her. She hadn't spoken much during the mission, her silence not quite the mark of someone lost in the thrill of the kill, but more like a predator biding its time. Irena caught a flicker of Irena's gaze as it turned momentarily to the others, her focus fleeting. Togi's form loomed ahead, his presence undeniable even in the quiet of the night. There was no outward tension, but Irena could feel it, an invisible thread pulling tighter between them. She could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on her, in the way the others moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the difference was there. And it made her blood run cold. The group pressed on, the faint rustling of leaves the only sound breaking the stillness. Irena took up the rear, her blue eyes constantly flickering to the shadows, her hand brushing against the stolen documents beneath her cloak. They were damp with the sweat of her palms, the edges already slightly smudged from the haste with which she'd grabbed them, but their importance burned through her. They held answers that had haunted her for months. She couldn't afford to let them slip away. Her thoughts churned, restless waves crashing against the shore of her mind. Had Irena noticed? The question lingered at the edge of her consciousness. Irena's gaze had briefly shifted away, but how much had she seen? Irena didn't trust her, she never had, and the way Irena moved now, the subtle tension in her shoulders, didn't help ease that suspicion. The silence between them all seemed to thicken with every step. It wasn't just the weight of the mission that pressed on them, it was the strain of unsaid words, of lingering distrust, of shifting allegiances. It wasn't just Irena feeling it. It was in the air. No one attacked, not yet, but the feeling of imminent danger, of a fracture waiting to widen, hung in the balance. As the group trudged through the dense forest, Irena's fingers tightened around the hilt of her dagger. Her jaw clenched, and a vow formed silently within her. Once she returned to the city, she would follow the trail alone. The documents would be her guide, no one else's. Whatever fleeting sense of unity they had, whatever brief alliance had existed, would splinter the moment she walked away. The truth was out there, and she couldn't trust anyone, least of all Togi's squad, to help her find it. The camp was a patchwork of shadows and strained silence. The faint rustle of leaves overhead, stirred by the cold night breeze, barely masked the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Togi stood at the center, his posture taut. His green eyes swept over the group, lingering for a moment on Irena before his voice cut through the stillness. We need to head back, he said, his voice low yet commanding. My father will want a full report. Cain, his massive frame leaning against a tree, snorted and adjusted the straps on his blade. Do we have to go back to him for everything? The mission's done, the hunters are dead. That should be enough. Togi's gaze snapped to Cain, his tone sharp, a warning beneath it. It's not just about the mission. Every action we take has consequences. My parents need to know what we've found here, before word spreads, or before the hunters regroup and retaliate. Corvin, sitting lazily on a fallen log, spinning a dagger between his fingers, flashed a sly grin. He means we're being watched, big guy. Gotta keep the leaders happy, or they start asking inconvenient questions. Togi's playing the dutiful son. Irena, leaning against a tree with her arms crossed, scoffed, the sneer evident in her voice. Inconvenient questions like why a bunch of vampires were skulking around a hunter-infested mill. Please, let them ask. Maybe Togi can impress his parents with his noble sense of duty. Togi's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. His tone remained steady, unwavering. This isn't about impressing anyone, Irena. It's about survival. And unless you've suddenly developed a taste for wood, you'll come with me. Enough, Irena interjected, her voice slicing through the conversation. Her blue eyes locked onto Togi's, unreadable but sharp. This doesn't involve me. The mission's done. I'm leaving. Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, the camp fell silent, the tension thickening like an approaching storm. Every eye shifted to Irena, and the weight of her declaration settled heavily on the group. Leaving? Irena echoed, her lips curling into a smug smirk. Of course you are. Always the lone wolf, aren't you? Let me guess. You just can't handle being part of a team. Or maybe you've got other business to attend to. Irena's gaze turned icy, the heat of her anger flickering in her eyes. Stay out of this. Irena raised her hands mockingly. Gladly. But don't come running back when you realize you can't handle it alone. Enough. Togi's voice thundered, commanding attention. He stepped forward, his presence dominating the space, a subtle threat in the air. Irena, you're not going anywhere. Irena's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing, her voice a low growl. I don't take orders from you, Togi. You do when it includes all of us, Togi countered, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. You think this is over? The hunters might regroup by tomorrow. You're smart enough to know that. Irena's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw clenching tightly. She said nothing, but the fire in her eyes flared, burning brighter than before. Irena, Togi continued, his tone softer now but still firm, I had your back tonight. The least you can do is have mine now. If you walk away, you're putting every one of us at risk. Putting you at risk? Irena hissed, her voice dangerous. You think I owe you something because of what happened back there? I didn't ask for your help, Togi. And if you think I care about your parents' approval, you're mistaken. I don't trust you. I don't trust them. You don't have to trust us, Togi replied, his tone biting. But if you walk away, it won't just be the hunters coming for you. My father will want answers too, Irena. We both know that you weren't very discreet these past weeks. You know what that means. Irena's gaze darkened, the crimson in her eyes glowing faintly. She loathed Togi's father and mother, the weight of their power and influence bearing down on her like a vice. Their coven was too large, too dangerous. She hated how exposed she felt under their scrutiny. She tilted her head slightly, a wry smile curling her lips. Is that a threat? It's a warning, Togi said, his voice steady but laced with something darker. You think you're cautious, Irena? You don't know the half of it. Cain, who had been silent up until now, shifted uneasily. His voice was gruff but softer than before. Look, Irena's got a point. If she doesn't want to go back, that's her call. But you're right too, Togi. Your parents aren't gonna like us running off in different directions now. We need to stick together, at least until this blows over. Corvin nodded, though the sly grin remained. Yeah, what he said. Strength in numbers and all that. Even if it's not exactly voluntary. I don't need your strength, Irena snapped, her eyes flicking from Cain to Corvin before locking back onto Togi. This mission is over. If you want to run back to your parents and beg for their approval or forgiveness, go ahead. But don't expect me to follow. Togi's expression hardened, his green eyes narrowing. You're not as free as you think, Irina. If you walk away now, it won't just be my parents asking questions. What do you think will happen when the hunters find out what you've been up to? Or when they figure out where you came from? You'll be alone, and they'll come for you. And when they do, you won't last. The words hit harder than she expected, but Irina refused to show it. Her fists clenched at her sides, her breathing steady but shallow. She didn't break eye contact with him, even as the weight of his words pressed down on her. Finally, she spoke, her voice laced with venom. Fine, whatever, I'll go with you. Togi's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his expression remained guarded. He gave a small, terse nod. Good, we leave before dawn. Irina turned away, her cloak billowing around her as she moved to the edge of the camp. Her fingers brushed against the stolen documents hidden beneath her cloak, and her mind shifted gears, already plotting her next move. Irina, still watching from the shadows, murmured under her breath, her gaze flicking to Irina with something unreadable in her eyes. So dramatic, she muttered, though her usual mockery lacked its usual bite. For once, even she seemed unsure of how this would all play out.